All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that our national office is on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nations, whose presence reaches back here 8,000 years. Algonquin Anishinaabe people continue to fight to have their legal rights respected in spite of decades of broken promises and erasure. We acknowledge their struggle to have their fundamental rights upheld, advance their community, and create more of a society for all who now share their ancestral home. We'll also put an equity statement in the chat. We just want to remind folks that today pay equity webinar um, and pay equity and remind everyone that pay inequity and gender discriminations are real and won't be subject for debate. And in today's question period, we just want to make sure everybody has a respectful tone towards the conversation. Now, I just want to introduce our subject matter expert and our speaker, Colby Briggs, the manager in compensation services. Hi, Colby.
Hi, Kat. Hi, everyone.
I'm Catherine Gagnon. I'm a member engagement officer here at PIPS. Before we get started, we're just going to go over some key information about our platform Zoom. Because of the size of the group, we have muted all lines to ensure the best sound quality for everyone participating and for those who will watch later. Please use the Q&A tool to send us a question during the webinar. There will be a question period later on. The session is being recorded. It will be posted on our website as well. I'll share that link in the chat in just a little bit. So we'll share all the resources necessary in the chat soon. Okay, so now we have a quick poll, a quick quiz sort of to get us started. In just a minute, you're going to see the questions on your screen. All right, so we want to know, when adjusted for things like hours and skill level, what is the gender pay gap in Canada? Do women typically make 72% of what men make? Do women typically make 88% of what men make? The gender pay gap is almost closed. Or the last option, there is no gender pay gap when adjusted for hours and experience. So it's just a little quiz. Colby is going to talk to us about that later, but we'll share the results with the group. Just waiting. Okay, so I'm going to share the results. So 70% of folks thinks it's 72% of what men make. 22% thinks it's 88% of what men make. 7% think the gender gap is closed. And 2% think that there's no pay gap when adjusted for hours and experience. So Colby is going to take us in a little bit around the history through the history around that. But first, let's just take a look at our agenda. Today we'll be discussing one of the biggest development in gender equity and workers' rights in the past decades, the implementation of the proactive pay equity in the federal public section.
Yeah, that's right. So, proactive pay equity is a totally new way of tackling the long-standing and really pervasive problem of the undervaluing of work typically done by women. Let's walk through, walking through our agenda here, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the path, including what we've tried to date. And as you'll see, probably what we've tried to date and what hasn't really worked. Then we're going to look about what's different this time around, namely the new framework that moves us from the old model, which was really reactive. It said discrimination is not allowed, but that's really hard to prove, right? And this new model, it's much more proactive and effective in nature, so we don't have to prove things as much. From here, I'm going to walk you through the 2018 Federal Pay Equity Act and the steps we've been taking here at PIPS to achieve that, to put that into place across the 18 pay equity tables where we sit.
From there, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we can work with our members and activists to make that happen. Lastly, we're going to look a little bit more of some of the achievements of PIPS and our colleagues, both from the labor movement and from some great employer reps to deliver on pay equity.
Absolutely. And then to close, like you mentioned, Kat, we're going to save some time, about 10 minutes for your questions. If we don't get to all of them today, we're gonna take note of some of those questions, and we're gonna try to put a FAQ or frequently asked questions or something like that on our website. And also, we will be posting our team's email on some of the slides so people can reach out to us with questions.
Absolutely. You'll get the team email. Remember, the presentation is recorded, so you'll get the link to that website as well. All right. So, Colby, on an earlier poll, it showed that there is some disagreement about the pay gap. What's going on?
Yeah, maybe we can start by saying that history has not always been fair to, I mean, pretty much everybody, but for the sake of today, we're talking about women. So history has not really been fair to women. If we look back, typically men and women have played different roles in society and the economy, but I think it's fair to say they both made equally meaningful contributions. And in spite of that, women have consistently trailed men in economic benefit from their labor, be that in the traditional economy through things like salary, or be it in other forms of compensation like your role in the household.
Yeah, I find it totally shocking to think that you used to be able to pay someone less just because they're a woman.
And the crazy thing is, that was first banned in 1977 when women, after adjusting for things like hours and skill level, made 63 cents on the dollar. So that's 50 years ago almost, and we're still that far behind. And keep in mind, when I use these statistics, so that 63 cents on the dollar, I'm already taking into account things like part-time status versus full-time status. So women often work fewer hours. And I'm also taking into account things like if you have an entry level role versus a senior role. So there is some adjustments there to make the stats a little bit more fair.
I guess that means if we just compare the average salary of women and men, the gap looks a lot worse.
Yeah, exactly. So these stats, if anything, are more favorable because we're trying to take into account things like part-time and full-time hours and where you are in the hierarchy of your employer. When we talk about pay equity today, we're really trying to make a fair and level comparison because the work we're doing to try to correct the undervaluing of work typically done by women, it's looking at that undervaluing of the types of work women do. We're not looking at the other obstacles women face. I'm thinking things like familial care obligations that might, impede a woman from working full time, or the impact of taking some time off to take care of your kids, how that might affect your career progression. Those issues, which are super important to gender equity, those are things unions and other organizations are working on that have fought for and won. So we have things now like maternity leave and parental leave. We have some more flexible working hours and conditions, depending on your employer. We now have public childcare being rolled out of Canada across Canada, and these things are going to be huge for gender equity and pay equity, but they're not really relevant for what we're talking today, which is the gender pay gap in the context of undervaluing of the work women typically do.
Thanks, Colby. So we banned the lady and man rates of pay, and I say that in air quotes, in the late 70s. Then in 1985, the charter came into effect, which gave workers a better legal avenue to challenge pay discrimination. That's that's what got us 67 cents on the dollar.
Yeah, exactly. So you see a little bit of progress there. Um, when things kind of really started to change was in the 1990s, when we saw the rollout of provincial pay equity laws. And some of these really started to move the needle because they really required an in depth and proactive analysis of pay systems. But most of them weren't the best. It was really in the early 2000s when Quebec rolled out its Pay Equity Act that we saw a law that was really good for workers. It was really designed that unions could be participants, that workers could be participants. It wasn't just the employer in charge of everything. And that did a lot to start making things change in the provincial sector in Quebec. So with this new model that kind of Quebec pioneered, I'm going to call it proactive pay equity, you really need to analyze the different aspects of the different things that go into a job. So you would look at something like, let's say a company has both hairdressers and mechanics. I don't know what company this is, but let's say it has both. Well, this pay equity committee would look at this and say, well, why are these people paid so differently? Why do hairdressers make so much less money than car mechanics, despite both of them having, this kind of same level of education, the same level of training? They both need the same difficulty of skills. They're different skills, but they both need, the same level of advancement in skills. The same type of health risks require same. They require the same amount of effort. It just doesn't make sense.
And now I remember hearing in 2009 the Conservatives made some big promises to federal public service workers. What's going on with that?
So overpromise and not deliver. So in 2009, the Conservatives brought in something called the Public Sector Equitable Compensation Act, pretending to be pay equity. It wasn't. It was an unworkable law that repackaged existing pay equity rules in a new package. They put a bow on top. This law, which the government never implemented, in other words, the law never actually came into effect. It was adopted, but you could never use it. It actually stripped unions of a real avenue to challenge pay discrimination by banning us from even filing complaints. Thankfully, the law never went into effect, and it was essentially replaced with this new law, the Federal Pay Equity Act, which was adopted in 2018.
Can you help us understand what all of this means, Colby?
Yeah. So we talked a little bit so far about the models we've tried to date. And most of these systems, other than the Quebec system, requires you, the worker, to prove there is discrimination. So the onus is on you to show there's a problem. That's relatively easy to do if you're talking about two different salaries for the same job. So if you have a job posting that says, "Hey, guys who do this make $10 an hour, women who do this make $8 an hour," that's easy to show. But that doesn't happen very much, and it's even harder to do if we're trying to compare different jobs with different salaries. How can you prove that an administrative assistant, for example, has the same value as a frontline technician, but the frontline technician who's a guy makes 30% more, even though what he's doing is more or less as skilled and more or less as difficult as the admin assistant? It's pretty much impossible to do.
It kind of sounds like this was doomed to fail from the start. Is that why government started bringing in proactive pay equity program?
Yeah, exactly. What we've tried did not work. What Quebec brought in did work. Uh, because in Quebec, it forced employers to set up independent committees with unions, with workers, if they're not unionized, so on. And these committees would really break down the work being performed. They'd give it a number, they'd say what its value is. And then they'd figure out if there's any trends when we look at the gender of those performing the work compared to how much they're paid and the value of the work.
And that's what your team is doing for our members?
Yeah, basically. So PIPS has been working across the 18 pay equity tables, the 18 pay equity committees, where we have members, and that's in the federally regulated sectors. So this law is only for those who are federally regulated, which includes both private employers, so like our colleagues at the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, for example, CRPEG, WPEG, WTEC, but also includes the public sector, so both the core public administration, Treasury Board, and things like the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, Destination Canada, so on and so forth. And we're trying to implement that 2018 federal law with our counterparts from the employer and other unions. And this federal law, it's really modeled after the Quebec law.
So, I think we all understand the general idea of equal pay for work of equal value, but it sounds a bit abstract. How do we get to pay equity?
So I'll go through the act more specifically in a little bit. Maybe I should say it is a super technical process. No one really wants to do pay equity in the sense that it's not something taught in HR school. It's like a very niche field that's very, very technical in nature. And because of that, PIPS has actually been one of the only unions that's built an in-house team of experts, our team in classification and pay equity here. And some of us were even involved in developing the actual pay equity law itself. So some of us from our team actually helped write that law. So PIPS has designated a staff person to every one of our pay equity tables, of every one of our pay equity committees, to make sure your rights are protected. And what we're trying to do there, basically as a general overview, is we're grouping together similar positions, so similar jobs, people who do similar work, into job classes. And we're figuring out what each one of these job classes do and how they do it, so understanding the work a little bit. And then we're coming to a value for that. So how much is that work worth? And then we're comparing these job classes that are typically male and the job classes that are typically seen as female. And if there's any trends in that, so if there's any patterns that say, jobs that are typically male that are of this value are paid more, Then jobs that are typically female at this value, well, then we have a pay gap, gender-based pay discrimination, and adjustments are going to be needed.
Wow. Okay. So it sounds like the work really challenges the pay systems.
Yeah, when we talk about the gendered pay gap here, we're not talking about bad people trying to cheat women. I think that's kind of the misunderstanding. It's well, I'm sure it happens, but most of the time here, this is really about long-standing and deeply ingrained unconscious biases about work and types of work. To give a really good example, think of orderlies and nursing assistants. Orderlies are the guys in white pushing around patients in hospital beds, and nursing assistants are the women with the little hats going around doing like some medical tasks, but not full nursing tasks. But back in the day, if you kind of imagine this caricature, these jobs were really similar in nature. They did a lot of the same thing. There was sometimes they were doing the exact same thing, but maybe orderlies had a little bit more of a heavy lifting role to them, and nursing assistants had a little bit more of a finesse and care role, so to be a little bit more careful. And guess what? One of these jobs was almost always men, and one of these jobs was almost always women. In spite of these jobs often doing the exact same thing, the pay was super different. And why was the pay super different? Well, chances are the real reason behind that is because society valued the job the guy was doing more because a guy was doing it.
Thank you so much, Colby. I just want to remind folks there will be a question period later on, so you can use the Q&A tool in Zoom if you have any questions. Sorry about that. How do we get to pay equity then, Colby?
So, kind of the step one in this process is union representatives and employer representatives. And if there's other unions involved, they'll send reps. If there's staff that are not unionized but can be unionized, they get representatives above. They sit down and form a pay equity committee. And the process to form this committee follows some really specific processes according to the law. It's not like we don't get to decide on a lot of things. The law is quite prescriptive in nature. And these committees are totally independent, consensus-based task forces that have some rules around how they operate. So the committees don't work for the employer, they don't work for the union. They're an independent organization that follows its own rules and gets to make its own decisions. And these committees, we've got 18 of them, as I said. They've been meeting for a few months to even a few years. Some of these committees meet 15 hours per week or more. This can be a full-time job. And their job is to build a pay equity plan, something we're going to talk about in a sec.
Because it's a consensus model, I guess that means workers have a lot of control over the process?
Yeah. So we are not kidding when I say this is one of the biggest changes to how our workplaces operate in decades here. Pay equity committees can totally dissect and rebuild pay systems. They do not have to follow the existing pay system. So unlike classification and job content stuff, if anybody's ever filed a classification or job content grievance, you're kind of stuck with what the employer says and have to paint between the lines here. But with pay equity committees, we get to redraw the lines. This being said, because all of our workplaces, generally speaking, already have pay scales in place and classification systems, we're usually a lot better off than the private sector or non-unionized workplaces. So we don't totally have to rebuild things. We were starting at an okay starting point.
Thanks, Colby. And then once you're in a committee, what do you actually do?
So one of the first things is the committee needs to understand the work that's being performed. So we want to look at what the reality looks like. So we look at what workers are doing and then group them into jobs or job classes. I'm going to use the term interchangeably here, but really it's a job class. So it's a group of jobs that seem similar. Usually a job class means your job title. So you and all the other engineers working at this place are grouped together. But really what's important here is we're linking different individuals, different workers performing similar tasks into a group. We're not comparing you, we're comparing your job class here. Like I said previously, we're not bound by the employer's existing systems. We're really looking at what's actually done, which is why it's so important for the Pay Equity Committee itself to understand what skills go into your work, what you do, what your responsibilities are, the mental and physical conditions in which your work's performed. So are you getting yelled at? Are you in a really hot room? Are you in a really cold room? Are you juggling, I don't know, 50 balls while answering math questions? Who knows? And what effort, in terms of physical, in terms of sensory, in terms of mental effort, goes into doing your job. So understanding those components of work.
So you figure out who does what and group them into a job class. Then what?
So the next step is to figure out if a job class is neutral, if it's male, or if it's female. To do that, we need to consider the gender of the people currently doing the job. So, what are the current incumbents? How do they identify? We need to look at the historical incumbency. So, what did this job look like? Who was doing this job 10 years ago, or over the past 10 years, or 15 years, or whatever? And probably most importantly, we need to understand if there's any social stereotypes about that job and about that work.
Stereotyping sounds really important in the public service. I know we have some great employment equality initiatives as well in the public service. But I
Yeah.
guess just because we might not have more female scientists or male administrative professionals at the typical organization, what does that does not really change pay?
Yeah, so that's it. The public service is sometimes a little bit weird. It's really cool in that it might be the one, sometimes the exception to the rule. So you might go into an office and all the secretaries are guys. But just because all the secretaries are guys does not suddenly mean that there's not a gender bias against the work. Like I said previously, we're really talking about like unconscious bias here. So this is not some evil person trying to discriminate here. What's happening more often than not, when you look at why do you have this pay scale? Why do you make what you make? Usually, when the salary of new jobs are created, so when these pay scales are established in the first place, it's based off market conditions, right? And market conditions are usually at some part based off discriminations. So if secretaries, let's say, we no one pays secretaries well because it's women's work, back in the day, that stereotype, it probably still exists in your workplace today because the pay scale was established so long ago, or the market conditions established this kind of notion, which then influenced your pay scale. So, what the Pay Equity Committee needs to do, it needs to figure out if there's a gender stereotype, if there's a gender, like a discriminatory gender bias kind of prejudice there that's underpinning your salary scale. We need to understand that at the Pay Equity Committee. And as a result of this, as a result of looking at stereotyping, you might actually see in the future when the plans are posted, you might see your job class is classified as female, even if you and all your colleagues are guys. And that's because the Pay Equity Committee is really trying to understand why you have the pay scale you have. And if the reason you have that pay scale was influenced by stereotypes.
Thanks so much, Colby. Now, I think we should also address folks who don't identify as male or female. How do they fit in?
Yeah, thanks for asking. That's a good question. The answer is where they want to be. So if we do use employer data or we do a survey, there's always room for self-identification. With this said, pay equity is a bit weird because we often talk about men and women as if it's a binary here. And that's because the scope of the law is really about this long-standing unconscious bias against women. And that's really been framed in a historical context of women's work and men's work. Non-binary folks are not overrepresented in any profession or field, really. So it's not really relevant to the work we're doing here. There's no field or profession that's underpaid because society says, oh, this is the work of non-binary folks. That doesn't mean there's not discrimination. That's totally real. That's a totally genuine thing. Individual cases of discrimination are absolutely real too, but there's no kind of systemic undervaluing of a particular type of work because non-binary people do it. So what one thing we do suggest in the labor community generally is our non-binary colleague, they can identify how they wish, totally up to them. There's also usually another option. But if you are given a survey, you may want to consider asking to be counted with the group that is usually experiencing systemic oppression, that is to say, women.
That makes sense, Colby. And this neutral category, that means a job class does not really have a perception or incumbency that leans towards male or female, so we just omit them from the exercise?
Exactly. So if a job class doesn't lean either way. There's no real stereotype. We omit it from the exercise because it's not useful. It doesn't show us the male pay trend. It doesn't show us a female pay trend. It's omitted from the exercise.
Thanks. Now, what's next once we have a good understanding of the job classes and the gender predominance of each one?
So now we need to get at that number I was talking about before. We need to assign a value to your job. And we use various tools, a variety of, job evaluation systems or tools to get at that number. They use pretty complicated models to identify the underpinnings of your job. So all these different tools, in one way or another, look at the skills you need to do that job, the responsibilities you have as the expectation of that job, the responsibilities of that job, the effort needed to achieve that job, and the conditions, mental, physical, in which you do that job. The committee decides on what system they want to use. There's an unlimited number of them. And the systems can change a little bit. So some systems might look at things like level of education. Some systems might look at the types of communications you do. Some systems might look at how autonomous you are. Some might look at how much you need to lift or move, or how often you need to move or lift. Are you doing a repetitive motion, or are you doing so? It can get really specific there. And then we take.
Sorry.
No,
go right ahead.
Thanks. And then we're going to take those factors and we're going to weigh them to make sure they align with the organization. So obviously, if you're working at a somewhere like Destination Canada that does marketing, creativity might be more important. Whereas if you're working at somewhere like a hospital, analysis of patient safety, analysis of conditions might be a little bit more important. And we also need to look at these factors in the context of discrimination. So we need to make sure that we're not giving too much weight to a factor that men typically do really good at and women don't do as well at, or vice versa.
All right. And you're looking at this globally, right? For example, not just my performance and what I do as an employee.
Yeah, exactly. So this is not an individual performance thing. You're grouped into a job class. And we're looking at what the job class as a whole would do and the conditions and responsibilities and whatever. So it's a global look there. How we get there, how do we figure out what the job class looks like? Well, we use things like maybe doing a survey of a sample of people doing the actual job. The committee might decide to interview some people at random doing the work. They might look at a task you did or a work product or something like that. They're trying to get a really global picture of the work that kind of smooths out any of those anomalies that individuals might have.
Thanks. So now that you figure out that my job is worth, for example, 432 points, what does that do?
Yeah. So, and you said but it's your job. So it's your job class that's 432 points there. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to take that number and we're going to compare the value to your pay. Or sorry, the job class's pay, I should say. For that, we need to figure out what the job class's total compensation is. And total compensation takes into account a little bit more than salary. So we're talking about your base pay, but also things like bonuses or performance pay, perks and insurance, pensions, if you get free parking, so on and so forth. So what we're going to do with that, and I have a chart coming up here, we're going to put a point on a graph, and one axis is going to be the value of your job, that 432, and the other axis is going to be the total compensation that goes with that job in dollars per hour.
And that will be the plan that members get to provide feedback on?
Exactly. So when we're done, we're going to post a plan with the adjustments, and you're going to see where some jobs came out and where total compensation came out and how that gets to the final result. And there'll be a period there for stakeholders. That means you to give comments on your plan and tell us what you think.
Thanks.
Oh. We're good?
Yeah.
Cool. So maybe one thing I should say here is if anybody's been paying really close attention, this was all supposed to be done last month. And our members have not seen more plans, largely because of employers. Most of our pay equity tables, despite the fact that my team has been emailing employers since 2020, so for 4 years, a lot of employers did not even start until 2023, until last year. So they were 5 years late getting to the table there. The Pay Equity Commission has been very generous with extensions. To the best of our understanding, no federal pay equity extension requests have been denied. And that's just not in the federal public service, that's any federally regulated organizations. There's been a lot of requests we're aware of. We don't know of any being denied. Unions have been pushing back on this quite a bit. With this being said, whether or not we're going to get any action on that front, most tables are really racing to complete the work as soon as possible. So I think we're going to start having more plans coming out in the next year or so. And if there are adjustments to be owed, they're going to be retroactive with legal interest from September of this year. In other words, as of the law says pay equity goes into effect this year. So I don't remember the date, it's like September 5th or something like that. If on September 5th, your job is identified as having a pay equity gap, you're underpaid because it's a female dominated job class, you're going to be entitled to a salary adjustment on a go forward basis as of September, even if an employer gets an extension. Not an exception, but just a little warning. If you do work for the Treasury Board, if you are in the core public administration, your plan's probably going to take quite a while. It's the largest plan in history. It's going to be very challenging. And frankly, the government is very, very, very slow at doing anything.
And who gets the adjustments? What happens if I quit or I retire? Does everybody get the adjustments?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. First thing to remember, anyone, regardless of your gender, in a job where there's a pay equity gap, gets the adjustment. It is not your gender that determines if you get a pay equity adjustment or not. It's the gender of your job. So if your job is considered to be a female dominated job class and it is underpaid when compared to the male jobs, that means that job gets a pay equity adjustment and everybody with that job title gets it. As I just said, the law goes into effect. I'm sorry, I don't remember the date, but it's like September 5th or something, 2024. So as long as you worked an hour in a job class that is subject to a pay equity adjustment, you are entitled to that pay equity adjustment for any time worked in the job class where the law should be in effect. So to phrase that in a less confusing way, let's pretend it's September 5th, you're in a job class, administrative assistant. The pay equity committee says, look, these people are underpaid by $1 an hour. You retire 3 days later. So you worked 21 hours in this job class, 21 hours in this job class after September 5th. You're going to be entitled to $21, even if you quit, even if you retire, whatever, because you did 21 hours in that job class during a period which was subject to a pay equity adjustment. So just to put it in an even more simple way, please, if you're planning on retiring, if you're planning on quitting, if you're planning on applying for another job, do not wait for pay equity to come into effect. It will be retroactive. You'll get what you're entitled to.
All right, Colby. Now, what about underpaid male jobs?
So this act, pay equity is a bad term. It should be pay equity, pay equity for women. It's only looking at pay inequity based on the undervaluing of work typically performed by women. So this is a job that tries to tackle discrimination against women. However, usually when an underpaid male job class is identified, employers will work with us to correct that issue, either immediately or as part of collective bargaining. Just to give a little example, when I worked at McGill University, we did pay equity. I was with the union there. And one of the jobs was female dominated, predominant, and they got a pay equity adjustment. And as a result of the pay equity adjustment, they started making more than their supervisor. The supervisor job was male predominant. So because of pay equity, the male job still made the same, but the female job that reports to them now makes 50 cents an hour extra or something. So what the employer said is like, we can't have this. This doesn't make sense. We're not going to be able to hire supervisors. Let's give the supervisor $1 an hour wage increase or something like that. So the employer usually voluntarily adjusts for pay discrimination against men as part of the problem.
So that's it in a nutshell. I also know that the law requires unions and employers to cyclically update the plan. So I guess your work is like never done?
Correct, yeah. Pay equity is evergreen. But when new jobs come out or as they change, we need to update the plan.
Thanks.
So here's a little visual to help people understand kind of what we're going for. Um, on this chart, you can see the male job classes, which are represented by blue dots, and the female job classes, which are the red dots. On one axis, you have the total compensation of the job class in dollars per hour. And on the other axis, the horizontal axis, you have the value of the job. So we plotted those, and then we've used a statistical analysis system to determine a trend line. So the trend line says what's the average female salary per point and male salary per point based on those dots. And it's very clear there is a pay equity gap there. So you see where the arrows, it shows that women are basically, if you kind of follow that entire line, women are typically making about $5 an hour less than their male counterparts who do work at the same of the same value. So there's different ways to close the pay equity gap. There's different systems in place. You can do all sorts of fun statistical things, but kind of the most simple one here would be just if we took all the red dots that are below that blue line and brought them up to the blue line, then we would close the gap. So, everybody would get about a $5 an hour increase there.
Thanks, Colby. That was super helpful. Can you tell me a little bit of how members are playing a role in this?
Yeah. Firstly, we've got our pay equity committees, and a lot of members have stepped up to volunteer for those. So thank you. While PIPS is assigned a staff member to lead each pay equity committee, many committees operate with one or more member representatives in addition to the staff rep. Members have also played a pretty key role as subject matter experts throughout this process. I don't know your job. A lot of the HR people from the employer at the committees don't know your job. You're the experts in your job. So we've been relying on you to support our work, both the pay equities work and the union's work here, as technical experts or experts on how the organization works. Some workplaces, some pay equity committees have conducted surveys of incumbents, that means to say you, or solicited your feedback about pay equity developments through things like emails or online consultations. I would ask everybody, please keep your eyes open to any emails you get from your pay equity committee or your union about this, and please try to participate if we are asking for your feedback.
Thank you. And most importantly, if you hear anything that doesn't seem quite right, please make sure you're reaching out to your union steward or the pay equity team at PIPS. I see your email is on the screen there, folks. I'm going to also put it in the chat. This goes for everything at PIPS, really. Employers sometimes have an incentive to keep things from us. So it's important that members keep PIPS in the loop as things come up in the workplace.
And just to give you a little anecdote there, some employers didn't even tell us they had formed a pay equity committee, despite the fact that we were actively in contact with these same people about pay equity. So they were getting emails from my team and the office of the president, President Carr, saying, hey, can you please let us know when you have a pay equity committee set up? Hey, what's going with pay equity? Hey, we're super late. Can you please communicate? And these people are saying, yeah, we'll let you know. Meanwhile, they had secretly set up an illegal pay equity committee. So, that happened more than a few times. So most of that, all of that's been fixed, and that shouldn't have happened. But we do really rely on members to be our eyes and ears. We'd also really strongly encourage members to, when your pay equity plan is posted, please read it really carefully. And please reach out to us. So reach out to payequity@pips.ca directly. Don't reach out to your pay equity committee. You can if you want. But passing through us first is going to make sure that we're able to make sure your feedback gets the full attention and make sure it's brought to the pay equity committee in the most strategic way so you get kind of the full value of our representation.
Okay, Colby, I just want to take a minute to celebrate some of our achievements in pay equity. Members have constantly told us how important pay equity is to them. So here at PIPS, we've really invested in this.
Yeah, we did a member survey a few years ago, and I think pay equity was like the fourth biggest priority of our membership, or third biggest, something like that. And that's why PIPS, like you said, it's really invested in this. We're the only federal public service labor union that's ensured there's a team of staff experts in pay equity and that they're protecting your interests in every single committee. So a lot of pay equity committees don't or have members on them, which is great, but they don't have someone with the same level of legal and HR background to do it. It's only PIPS that's really making sure that's happening. Just if we look back history, in 2019, PIPS came out swinging here. We were one of the groups that actually helped develop the pay equity regulations. So we were part of a small group of labor groups that were consulting with the government to actually write the rules that go with the law, the regulations that are part of the legislation there. From there, we've remained pretty closely involved with how the law rolls out as one of the advisors to the Pay Equity Commission. So they have kind of a consulting group, task force, whatever. We sit on that to help develop procedures and policies and practices that support the Commission's implementation of the Pay Equity Act.
That's so important because our work here also means that we can bring up workers at other organizations, including those who don't have access to union representation.
Yeah, this law has the potential to do so much for gender equity in Canada, especially in the private or non-union sectors. Just to give another anecdote here, Prince Edward Island has the highest rate of, it's a little bit complicated, but essentially workplaces that are likely to have some type of pay equity plan in place. So classification systems, a lot of union representation, a lot of like formulaic approaches to salary scales, essentially what pay equity is trying to achieve here. And it has by far the smallest pay equity gap in Canada. I think it's around 4 or 5%. So it shows that pay equity really works here. And essentially what we're trying to get is in the federal sector, we're trying to get to that Prince Edward Island situation. So it's not just us, it's everybody. So it's really important this law works really well for all sectors here. So PIPS is really supporting that process. Another thing we've done, which I think is really cool, is PIPS was actually the first major organization to roll out a training on implementing the acts. Last year, I think in January of last year, we actually invited employers. We actually invited the Treasury Board to come to our offices and we trained them on the Pay Equity Act. We actually crafted the training that a lot of organizations now are using about how to implement the Pay Equity Act. We gave that 3-day training another time as well. So we've trained a lot of our employers. We've trained a lot of other unions. We've trained a lot of non-union representatives on how to implement this act. And it's meant that PIPS has really been able to kind of set the agenda at some of the tables here and really prevent some problems and keep the employers on task really to tackle this issue of pay inequity.
That's amazing. And I think it's fair to say that's been really taking the lead at many of the pay equity tables. We've already been out there defending your rights.
So PIPS has really been there for making sure this law is implemented properly. If anybody saw the movie Aaron Brockovich, I think sometimes we feel a bit like that, if I can give a not so humble brag there. One of the cool things that we were really involved in, for example, is there's a landslide victory for labor here on multiple plans. It's posted on our website if anybody's interested. And what happened is maybe about a year ago, the Treasury Board put in a request to the Pay Equity Commission to break down the core public administration into different pay equity plans. It's something that's allowed in the Act. They can make a request. This is a strategy that a lot of employers use, and it's kind of a sneaky strategy. And what it does is, if they break you down into 3 different plans instead of one plan, there'll be fewer comparators. So it's harder to achieve pay equity because they're not going to necessarily need to compare every job to every job. They only need to compare jobs within a different plan. So it's a pretty sneaky way to avoid pay equity. And the Treasury Board being the biggest the biggest employer in the country, if they were allowed to do this, it means that a lot of employers would be allowed to do this. It would mean banks would be allowed to do this, whatever. It really would kind of open the floodgates to implementing this sneaky strategy to undermine pay equity. Well, we challenged it and we won. It was 100% victory for unions. And this precedent, it is the precedent for multiple plans. Employers are now not asking for multiple plans because if they're like the biggest employer in the country with the best reasons to have multiple plans didn't get it, why am I going to request it? So that was really cool and something PIPS did. I think people, to the impact of pay equity here, why are employers trying to undermine pay equity? Well, a typical pay equity plan like this, when implemented, it might increase payroll costs to 1%, 2%, maybe 3 or 4% in the private sector there, and that costs a lot of money. If you talk to employer side consultants, so lawyers giving advice on pay equity to employers, the first thing they talk about is minimizing risk, which is a really nice way of saying, how do we prevent pay equity? How do we make it so we don't have to do pay equity adjustments? And, frankly, from where I'm standing, where from PIPSC is standing, paying 1 or 2% is not a justification to keep underpaying women. Enough is enough. We need to deal with pay equity.
Thanks, Colby. That was really great. We're going to get to questions now. If you have any questions for Colby, I do see some in the queue. Please use the Q&A tool in Zoom. You'll find it in the Zoom taskbar. There's also, I've put in the chat, the Pay Equity email address if you need to reach Colby's team, as well as the link of the Pay Equity webpage where we're going to be posting some FAQs and the recording. So Tazim is asking, will the employees be compensated for back pay and wage difference?
So what's going to happen is, as of September of this year, the pay equity, if an employer was organized, they would have implemented your pay equity adjustments they have a couple of weeks to do it, but it should be effective September 2024. If your employer is late getting the plan done, whether or not they've got an extension, it doesn't matter. They're going to have to backdate everything. So let's say the plan is finalized in January. In January, the employer is going to say, okay, oops, this job class should have been paid $1 an hour more. So we're going to pay the person retroactive to September, the $1 an hour, plus legal interest. And I think legal interest is 5.5% or something like that. It changes a little bit. So you're entitled to that. The term we use in labor relations is you're made whole. So they've got to pay you retroactively in today's value. So it's like they had fixed it on time like they were supposed to.
Thanks so much, Colby, and thanks, Tazim, for your question. We have another anonymous question here. The CRA asked for an extension on the Pay Equity Act implementation, or I think they did. What does that mean for CRA?
Yeah, I don't know if they actually got it. I have too many tables to remember. Our team's trying to be better about web posts. So if you do go on your group page, we try to post about pay equity every 3 months there. So there might be information there. What an extension is employers are asking. So if you have to finish pay equity no matter what. So whether or not you make the deadline, you still have to do it. But an extension request is essentially saying, can I submit my homework late without getting in trouble for it? And like I said, every one of our tables, I think with one exception, has put in for an extension request, and almost everybody's got it. If an extension request is ever denied, all it means is that the employer still has to do the work. They still owe legal interest, whatever, but the commission might levy a fine saying you were negligent, you took too long, here's a $10,000 fine or something like that. So for our members' purposes, extensions really don't change anything. It means they're late, but you still get retro, you still get legal interest. That's it. It just means it takes a little bit more time to get it done.
And how would someone know the progress of the Pay Equity Committee for their job class?
So depending on how your committee operates, some committees do send out emails every month or two. If that's not, well, whether or not that's the case, you can also check your group page on PIPSC's website. Like I said, we do try to post every 3 months or so. We're trying to get a little bit faster on doing that. Unfortunately, we are a pretty small team and it's a lot of work, but we're doing our best with our resources there. But if there's nothing recent there, I would recommend you fire off an email to payequity@pips.ca. And Linda from our amazing file intake team is going to find out the status for you or put you in touch with your staff member on that pay equity committee and give you a little update.
Thanks for that, Colby, and thank you for your question. Felicity wants to know if someone is in a job class identified as predominantly male, such as scientists, as she understands it, this pay equity exercise won't be addressing pay equity for women in this job class. Is that right?
Yeah. So, Felicity, what I would say is what you're talking about is probably not pay equity. Pay equity in this context means your job class. So all the BI ones, biologist level 1, BI level 2s, whatever, are they paid fairly vis-a-vis, is that salary scale fair when compared to other salary scales? And it's particular, are the male salary scale or are the female salary scales fair when compared to the male salary scale? if there's problems within the pay scale. So we've heard from some members that they feel like, for example, women, oh, sorry, got another meeting there, feel that women are maybe not promoted as often or fairly, or if women are hired from outside the public service and the employer says, hey, we're going to start you on salary scale 2, but then a guy who comes in and with the same experience is started on salary scale 3. That's employment equity. Technical difference there, but that's not something we're dealing with under the Pay Equity Act. That's something that needs to be addressed through an employee relations officer at PIPS. So talk to your ERO. And if there is a systemic problem there, they can look into it with the employer or maybe have the negotiator look into it or do some research to see if there's a systemic problem on where people are. But that's not part of pay equity per se.
All right. Another anonymous question. Will the pension be adjusted if one retires?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, perfect. So we have a
Easy
couple of
answer.
folks who were asking that question. Melissa would like to know what will happen if my job classification is categorized as neutral, but the equivalent classification to mine is male dominated and paid more for the same work. Will my classification not be assessed?
So I don't I don't know how that situation is possible. If you're in the core public administration, your job class is going to be your subgroup and level. So, community health nurses level 1, community health nurses level 2, scientific regulation level 2, whatever. And that job class itself is going to be considered male, neutral, or female based on how the committee decides for that employer. So I don't think there's any situation where, like, maybe it's different in the private sector, maybe it's different at a different organization, but that's not really relevant. The committee is really deciding at this organization, is this job male, female, or neutral based on who's currently doing the job, who historically did the job, and what's the stereotype of that. If I have not answered your question well, please send an email to payequity@pips.ca and we'll see if we can help out with it there.
Absolutely. We still have time for a few more questions, but if you're looking for more information, Colby's team is amazing and they'll be able to help you out. A couple of folks want to know, how do they know if their position is being assessed? Like a female in IT, for example, or any other position, really.
Yeah, so I mean, every position will be assessed. Again, if you're in the core public administration, your job class is going to be CS1, CS2, CS3. If you're at an agency like CFIA, the job class is going to be a little bit more discretionary. So the committee is going to decide how, if they group different job titles together. So it might not be just group and level, it might be a little bit more nuanced there. When the pay equity plan is posted, it will be posted with what your job class is. So if it's not the core, it's going to say what job titles went into that job class, and then it's going to say what the gender predominance of that job class is. And at that point, if you think there's a problem, you can totally, I would recommend you write to PIPS, not the committee, but you could write to PIPS and say, like, hey, why the heck is my job class female predominant? Like, we're all guys. Or why the heck is my job class male predominant? It's all women, and like it's always been all women. So that I don't think we can share that information earlier just because how the committee operates is confidential, but you could always write to your pay equity committee or PIPS if you have a concern. So if there's a reason you think we might make a mistake or there's some kind of weird situation you want to bring to our attention, yeah, fire it off to payequity@pips.ca so we can keep that in mind.
Thank you, Kobe, and thank you for your question. All right, another one. You're on a roll. How are the same jobs in different organizations going to be assessed consistently? Is there a chance the pay could be different between departments? Example, there are communication professionals across the government of Canada.
So I know this person's asking about the Treasury Board, but again, I want to drill home the point. Your employer is either like an agency, so Canadian Revenue Agency is one pay equity plan. This Canadian Revenue Agency plan has nothing to do with the core public administration pay equity plan. Different employers, different plans. There is no pay equity between different employers. It's only pay equity within an employer. But like you pointed out, the government of Canada is massive. It's what, 400,000 or 500,000 employees, so there's a lot. Maybe It's a great question. It's going to be really hard because what we need to do is we need to understand what does a CS2 who works, or sorry, IT2, my new terms, what does an IT2 who works for the government of Canada look like as a job class? And there's, I'm guessing, 3,000, 4,000 IT2s, and some of them are, bringing backpacks up to northern areas and installing IT equipment, and some of them are providing, research onto some sort of coding thing. I don't know what CS's ITs do, sorry, but there's going to be a lot of variance in the role. It's really, really hard to do. We're not there yet, but I imagine what the committee would do is one, they'd gather all the job descriptions used in this. And we did recently work with the employer to roll out a new job description for this group, but it doesn't work for all groups. And they're probably going to do some interviews or some questionnaires of incumbents. And then what we're going to try to do is kind of get, again, a really global picture. So we're not going to be that precise. We're not trying to capture every little nuance. We're trying to make a generality of the work. If there's big anomalies, that's going to be really hard, and the committee is going to try to have to figure out how to deal with that. But generally speaking, because we're trying to get an average there, we can kind of leave out those anomalies just to get a really general picture of what generally is the skill level needed for this job, what generally is the difficulty or the challenge of responsibilities for this job, so on and so forth.
Last question, Colby. Do you have time for one more?
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Similar to how the unions negotiate pay raises, and it ultimately affects non-union RCMP cast members several months later. Do you anticipate something similar for these federal workers as well?
Yeah. So, are we? So, I guess we're asking here about is
Like
pay equity coordinated between organizations, or are we
if
coordinating?
non-unionized, the way I read it anyway, if non-unionized employees, are they going to have the benefits of the pay equity system, even if they're not in a union?
Yeah. So, how the pay equity committee works? So the employers give a certain number of reps. Each union gets a minimum of one rep. The law doesn't say a maximum. It's very frustrating when we have to negotiate. And then if there are people working at that employer who can be part of a union, but who are not part of a union. So they're eligible to be unionized. That means they're not managers and they're not doing anything confidential or like HRE. Those people get to vote on a rep to represent them. Irrespective of if there is a rep there or a non-rep, irrespective if there is or is not someone representing non-unionized workers, these committees operate by consensus. So really, the PIPS rep on this committee is not there to represent PIPS. Sure, they're the expert in PIPS. Sure, they work for PIPS. Sure, it's your money paying our salary. We're there for PIPS. But really, we're trying to bring everybody up. So, there's been times in a lot of committees where PIPS is really making sure we understand a PSAC job really well because we want to make sure we're accurate for PSAC members. And because this thing works globally, there's no interest in making a PIPS job look really good or a PIPS job look really bad, because what we're doing is we're trying to get those trend lines. So it's important for all the stakeholders. It's important for the alliance, it's important for the employer, whatever, to make sure every job is rated carefully and fairly, and you get the correct gender predominance and the correct total compensation, because every single job is going to affect every single other job. It's really a global picture there. So I think that's a really long-winded way of saying, yes, we look out for non-union people.
All right. Oh,
Okay,
yeah.
so that's my cue to give a summary. Oh, no,
No,
sorry.
no, no, no.
Let's
I
over to
mean, if
you.
you want
No, 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 no.
I
Let's
know.
leave it to you. Sorry,
No
Pat.
worries, no worries. We're just going to review everything we've covered today. So, firstly, we discussed a history of gendered pay gap, included what has been tried to address it. Then we looked at the Federal Pay Equity Act and how PIPS is working to implement it across our federally regulated membership. Then we looked at how PIPS is working to lift all workers and close that equity pay gap for everyone. Lastly, we discussed what pay equity might mean for you and what to expect next. So I want to thank you so much, Colby, for your expertise. I really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone who took the time to join us today. The email address is on the screen and in the chat if you need Colby's team.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Kat. Have a great week.
Have a great day.